Greetings. This presentation shows physician and practice level performance compared to target values for 5 quality measures for the years 2016 and 2017. The specific measures we'll be looking at will all be related to cardiovascular health. We'll be looking at blood pressure check, blood pressure less than 140/90, smoking assessment for cardiovascular health, LDL less than 100 for cardiovascular health, and finally we'll be looking at blood pressure control less than 140/90 for DM and cardiovascular health. What I'm hoping to accomplish is that this visualization may help clinicians as well as others such as administrators, researchers, and policymakers understand the processes and methods of providing care that are more successful than others and result in better and more efficient health care for individual patients. This information hopefully can then be used to duplicate the successful processes and methodologies to other healthcare organizations, thereby improving the healthcare for all patients across HCOs. The specific question we're trying to answer here is which practices and providers perform best against a set of standard measures. From there, subsequent measures can be performed to determine what specific processes or methodologies are used by those successful practices and providers, and to see if those processes and methodologies can be duplicated among other HCOs. Note that this initial step does not accomplish those last two. This first step is simply about answering the question, who does the best job against standard measures? The subsequent steps are not part of the visualization and should be undertaken using subsequent research, perhaps even with the individual HCOs that are successful themselves. Now, there are some limitations to our data that was available for us. It's not available for every measure, month, practice, and provider, so we will see gaps in the data such that the visualization shows those breaks for some of these measures in some of the months. However, that does not take away from the central message, since the trend lines, minimums, and maximums still show those HCOs that are generally more successful than others at the respective measures. Added to the visualization are minimum and maximum lines that show the extremes of the data points. So with that, let's get right into looking at the data. As you can see here, we've got information from Andiscoggin, the practice, and Fayette, which is the provider. You can see that there are some gaps in the data here, but generally the provider performs above the standard targets, which is shown right here. And then you've got the maximums here and the minimums here for the provider's performance with this target. As we kind of scroll through the data, we see that for Aroostook and Beals, we've got a little bit more data than previously. And again, we're showing the maximum and the minimum. In this case, they are all pretty much above the target, which is 0.75 or 75%. And we scroll down more, we've got other providers here, for example, the same practice for the smoking assessment, generally performing above the target, but there are some occasions, some months where it does dip below the target, and so that's one of the things that may not have been an initial goal of this research, but something that we still might want to look into regardless. As we move further into our data, we've got some good data here for some of these providers. And here for Cumberland practice, Camden, we've got some very good data for blood pressure and BP less than 140/90. You can see there was an initially the provider performed above the target, and then something happened for certain months where they didn't perform quite up to where they had hoped. Again, now here's another provider in the same practice that did well with smoking assessment, consistently and always above the target for smoking assessments. As we scroll through some more of the data, we see here another provider that performed consistently above the target for both smoking assessment and LDL. Same practice, different provider. Blood pressure, performing well. And here's a provider for smoking assessment that generally didn't do too well, although for some months they did. It looks like they made some kind of improvements in the month of August that helped them get above that target. Whereas other providers, for example, here, Knox, this provider, they're consistently below the target. So what I would recommend based on these results is that we look at some of the other more successful practices and providers that we've seen in this study and see if we can duplicate what they do, the way that they approach these measures and these targets. See if we can duplicate that with some of these providers that that may not have done quite so well against the target. So in summary, I think this was a very good exercise in trying to understand who the better performers were for many of these measures related to cardiovascular health. And again, subsequent research should examine the processes and methodologies that these successful providers are using. That is not part of this study. Again, I want to emphasize that should be done after this data is fully researched. Go in and maybe spend some time with some of those providers to understand how they approach them, and then see if those processes and methodologies can be duplicated with some of the less successful providers. Thanks very much for your time, and hope to see you again soon.